And good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. Happy Tuesday, by the way. And of course, I wasn't with you yesterday, as I announced last week. Yesterday, June the 20th, was my wife and my 53rd wedding anniversary. Now, I would tell you the whole story about our wedding day, but that would take up the whole video. It was an amazing day. Just a couple of real brief things here. My dad was supposed to perform the wedding ceremony. He had what we thought was a heart attack, so they had to run him to Arkansas. So I had to run my sales route. He was supposed to do that for me, and that was way before cell phones. I didn't know if my dad was going to live or die. I was out on my sales route, having to make like a 300-mile round trip. I didn't know what was going to happen. Jan, my now wife of 53 years, kept telling everyone, I'm not going out until I know he's at the building, period. Well, to make a long story short, we were supposed to get married at 8 o'clock. And at 20 minutes till 8, I pulled my sales truck into the parking lot. And they had a basin of water there. And remember, this is in June. I've been sweating and working all day long. So they had a basin of water there and a wash rag for me and my suit. And so, here I am. I walk in. I'm trying to bathe off. Jan was in the back. She was all dressed up, ready to walk out. But again, she had said, I'm not going out there until he's here. And so here we are. Well, I found out, obviously, when I got there, my dad was okay. And my brother-in-law, who was a preacher, but he was not registered in Oklahoma, was going to perform the ceremony. He wasn't licensed in Oklahoma. We had not practiced with him, obviously. So, I walk out, Jan walks down the aisle, and my brother-in-law leans down and says, just follow me. So that's what we did. And he performed the ceremony. When my dad got a little bit better, he signed the papers to make everything legal and right. Yeah. That wasn't the whole story, but I don't have time for any more. It really was quite a day. And here we are 53 years later. It has been 53 years of absolute incredible happiness, wonderful joy, wonderful fulfillment. I have said on many, many, many occasions, my wife is my rock. She is the one that builds me up. She is the one that encourages me. She is the one that just, she's irreplaceable in my life. So anyway, we enjoyed yesterday a day off. We went out to eat at a nice restaurant. We did have our plans made to go out of town and, get a hotel, go to a nice restaurant and what have you. We just decided we couldn't afford that whole thing. So anyway, we're doing that locally. That is to say, we're going to go out to eat at a nice restaurant this evening and, just kind of kick back and relax. So here we are. We did that last night, by the way, on Monday. This is Tuesday. So anyway, I want to continue our investigation and our study of the Olivet Discourse. We have been focused on Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. That in the last days, at the coming of the Lord, the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven, when he would sit on the throne of his glory and all the nations would be gathered before him, it would be at that time that it would be the time of judgment. And I've pointed out to you before, and I've documented this quite well, I think, that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is taken directly from Joel chapter 2 and 3. Now let's keep in mind that Joel chapter 2 and 3 foretold the last days and the great and terrible day of the Lord. In the last days, the Spirit of the Lord would be poured out in a miraculous measure. Sons and daughters would prophesy, old men would dream dreams. The Lord said, I will show wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth beneath before the coming of the great and the terrible day of the Lord. So here are the miraculous gifts that were to be a sign of the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. in the last days. And the great and terrible day of the Lord is the great and terrible day of the Lord foretold by John the Baptizer as Elijah. More on that later this week, because boy, this is incredible. So I want to focus this morning on the fact that Joel chapter 3, in describing the events of the last days and the day of the Lord, has this to say. Joel chapter 3. Now, we talked about last week that in the last days and at the day of the Lord, it would be the time of the harvest. We correlated that with Matthew 13, Matthew 25, and Revelation chapter 14. Revelation chapter 14 tells us the hour of the harvest had arrived 2,000 years ago. Now watch. Joel 3:14. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. The sun and the moon will grow dark, and the stars will diminish their brightness. The Lord will roar from Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem. The heavens will shake, but the Lord will be a shelter for his people and the strength of the children of Israel. Did you notice the language? Sun and the moon being darkened, the earth being shaken, heaven and earth being shaken. Sound familiar? Well, it ought to. This is the language. This is the typical language in the Old Testament to describe any time that the Lord intervened into history, not to end history, but to judge this nation over here by incorporating this nation as his instrument. For instance, the Lord used the Assyrians as his rod, the staff of his wrath, Isaiah chapter 5, 10 and following. Isaiah 10, 5 and following, So, the Assyrians were God's wrath, or the rod of his wrath. They were the staff of his anger. And in Micah chapter 1, in describing that judgment at the hands of the Assyrians, is before it says, behold, the Lord comes out of heaven, and he rides on the tops of the mountains, and the mountains are melted beneath his feet. The sun is dark and the moon does not give its light. Now, wait a minute. This is when the Assyrians were used by Yahweh in his sovereignty to judge the 10 northern tribes of Israel who were carried off into Assyrian captivity in 721 BC. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the literal physical appearing of Yahweh out of heaven, has nothing to do with Yahweh literally visibly walking on the tops of the mountains, has nothing whatsoever to do with the mountains literally melting beneath his feet, has absolutely nothing to do with the sun, the moon, and the stars being shaken and falling out of the sky. Nothing. This is typical apocalyptic. Now that's a big word, apocalyptic. What does that mean? Well, we sometimes refer to that as decreation language. And what it means is language is used that if you took it literally, all right, if you took the language absolutely literally, you would have to come to the conclusion that literal physical heaven and earth have been destroyed many, many times, because after all, many times in the prophetic books, both the major prophets and the minor prophets, the Lord came. He came out of heaven. Heaven and earth were shaken. And I'll document this more tomorrow. But the point I want us to see this morning is that Joel 2 and 3 is the background and the source for Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. Joel predicted the coming of the great and the terrible day of the Lord in the last days, when the Lord said, I will gather all nations to judgment. Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is the gathering of all nations to judgment. But Joel said in that time of the gathering of the nations to judgment, the sun would be darkened, the moon would not give its light, heaven and earth would be shaken, and the Lord would roar out of Zion. Now, let me tell you something about this coming of the Lord out of Zion very quickly. Anytime in the Old Testament that the Lord came out of Zion, it could mean one of two things. It could mean that he would come to the aid of his people, but most of the time, if the Lord roared out of Zion, it meant that someone was about to be judged. Someone was about to be destroyed. So here's the language of the coming of the Lord out of Zion, roaring out of Jerusalem, when the sun and the moon would be darkened, heaven and earth would be shaken in the last days at the great and terrible day of the Lord. Now that means that Matthew chapter 25 is the great and terrible day of the Lord, when the Lord would roar out of Zion, when heaven and earth would be destroyed or shaken. And guess what? In Matthew chapter 24, 29 to 31, Jesus said, speaking of the events leading up to and consummating in the fall of Jerusalem, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give its light, the stars of heaven shall be shaken, and the powers of the heaven shall be shaken. Then they will see the sign of the Son of Man in the heaven, and they shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He shall send forth his angels with a shout, with the sound of the great trumpet, and they shall gather together the elect from the four winds of the heaven. Now I want to ask you a question, and I'm going to have to develop this more later. What is the difference between Matthew chapter 24, 29 to 31, and Matthew 25, 31 and following? What's the difference? Well, I said that tomorrow we'll examine the language of the sun being darkened, etc., etc. We'll have to do that on Thursday. No, this is Tuesday. So tomorrow we're going to look at the comparison between Matthew 24, 29 to 31, and Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. Folks, there is no temporal distinction. There is no thematic distinction. There is no motifal distinction. These are parallel passages. Let me encourage you to get my copy of my book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, in which I discuss this language of the sun being darkened, the moon being turned to blood, the stars falling from the sky, etc., in great detail. And I'll investigate that with you tomorrow, on Wednesday. You have a great day. I'll see you on the flip side.